Ben had fought Fistrik's gang, having beat Liam and Bubble Helmet, though Fistina had spare rocket fists, and Fistrik was ready to fight against Frankenstrike using insulated boxing gloves, though that didn't much help when being punched in the face with an electrically charged fist. Yeah, he wasn't as smart as he seemed to think he was. Whatever his new plan was, it was a clear downgrade from last time they'd fought. While dealing with them, Lucy and Gwen had landed the ships just outside the building and broke their way in, coming in to join the fight as Bubble Helmet and Liam were starting to get up slowly, though Ben grabbed Liam by the shoulder and zapped him, dropping Liam again, meaning it was now Fistrik, Bubble Helmet, and Fistina. Gwen had started fighting Bubble Helmet. She'd cast different spells to trap them in a ring of fire and knock them backwards, cracking their helmet before busting it off of them completely. This also caused the gases in their suit to come spewing out, making them pass out from being unable to breathe until a replacement was put on them. Lucy had been fighting Fistina, while Gwen fought Bubble Helmet. It seemed like Fistina had the clear advantage as her body was much more solid than Lucy's, and she'd actually put her fist completely through Lucy's head, causing her to melt onto the floor. Little did she know Lucy was living clay, and could simply reform and move her body as she needed. Because of this, Lucy began to move her melted body, that was currently in the form of a puddle, slowly into Fistina's robotic joints and cracks in her cybernetic body, as she'd continued until she was completely inside, then began to slowly reform herself together into her fully open form, which caused the pieces to be violently forced apart instead of being detached normally. This made her go all to pieces as Lucy stood over her in her fully alien non-humanoid form. While the girls were handling them, Ben had timed out and continued fighting Fistrik bare knuckle. The two were having a street brawl, and it was clear that Ben was the better fighter, as he could switch up fighting styles in an instant whenever he needed. This made it harder for Fistrik to figure out what type of attack was gonna come next, and then Ben went to throw a haymaker which they'd prepared to block. At the last second, Ben then threw himself towards the ground and swept Fistrik's leg, knocking them off balance before kicking him with the sole of his boot directly in the gut, sending him backwards, crashing into a table. This had angered them, and they'd grabbed the first thing they could and began swinging it at Ben, who'd started dodging backwards and sidestepping so that he didn't get backed into a wall. Suddenly, someone called out to Fistrik saying that it was ready, and they all turned to see Corvo, the guy that Ben and Rook arrested the first time they had to deal with Fistrik, and the Nostinians, activating something as Fistrik then threw what he was holding at Ben and ran off towards whatever Corvo was activating, as the ground began to shake and a ship tore through the ground and began to lift up out of it. They began to try to fly away, with Lucy running to get to her ship to chase after them, Ben and Gwen doing the same with their own ship as well. The three began to start a dogfight in the air and began flying around trying to avoid one another's blaster fire. However, the ship Fistrik had was equipped with more powerful weapons with longer firing time, meaning they could keep shooting while Lucy and Ben and Gwen couldn't. Ben and Gwen's ship was caught in the blast, and it had tore holes in their ship's wings before continuing to blast its way through everything, eventually making its way to the core and causing it to explode and be blown to bits. They didn't stick around to check out the damage, and instead hit the thrusters to put some distance between themselves and Lucy. Thankfully, Ben and Gwen were okay, as she'd had one of her magical shields up and he'd changed into Roadblock, reinforcing it with one of his own. The problem now, however, was that they were dropping out of the sky at an accelerating rate, though thankfully Lucy had taken notice and circled around, with them dropping onto her ship as she'd asked if they needed a lift. The two dropped their shields and thanked Lucy for the help through the communications function on the Omnitrix. Afterwards, he'd struck the symbol again and changed into Vampire, asking Gwen if she was going to be able to keep going after what just happened with their ship. She'd responded that she could and that they would be alright. Gwen then began chanting another new incantation Ben hadn't heard her using before, as her body was covered in her magical powdery, glittering blue energy energies once more, with her form beginning to change as wings began to sprout forth from her back, covered in the energies, and slowly began to reveal themselves until the energies had faded, showing that they were a very soft blue that was nearly white in color. Gwen's eyes were also owl-like now, with her hands and feet appearing to be sharp claw-like nails, and her clothing changed to be a dark blue tunic with purple-colored markings on them. She then smiled teasingly, seeing Vampire standing there with his mouth agape and pushed it closed, asking if she was so beautiful that he couldn't speak. Ben smiles in response and kisses Gwen, calling her his angel of the night, saying that they should hurry to catch Fistrick and take them down. Nodding, the two then began flying off, with Lucy saying to wait up because some of them couldn't fly without a ship, and they continued flying faster and faster, catching up to Fistrick, who'd thought he'd finally gotten rid of them, having blown their ship to bits. Corvo noticed first and pointed out to Fistrick that they had visitors. Confused, they asked what he means, as they suddenly heard tapping and saw two sets of ethereal eyes, one an icy blue and the other an emerald green, glowing beside them, followed by a rather twisted sort of grin as they see a hand then stab into the glass with the tips of its index finger and cutting a large hole into it before it then let the glass fly off the ship. They grabbed Fistrick and flew up higher as Vampire was holding them up with his twisted grin, looking at them like they were a slab of meat ready to be eaten, making them begin to freak out a bit, though he simply let them go and drop where they were as Gwen had taken Corvo from the same hole Ben had put in the ship's glass, as it started to nosedive without anyone in control of it. Lucy used her ship's cables to keep Fistrick's ship from crashing into the ground, as they hear him screaming in terror and look to see him dropping from several hundred feet, free-falling in the air with no parachute or anything to break his fall, though we also see Ben flying down after him and grabbing them up before they hit the treetops and then throwing him towards Lucy's ship. Gwen flew over as Lucy opened up the hatch for them to all come inside, where they could arrest Fistrick and Corvo, along with the other three that were already cuffed back at the building, though Ben was being more violent than usual, and after cuffing Corvo, Gwen flew out to try to calm him down, telling Ben to stop, saying that he's already not able to fight back anymore. He continues to throw them around, and Gwen cast an illumination spell that lit up the area around them for a little bit, which burned Vampire, causing him to shake his head as Fistrick began falling towards the ground, and he'd flown down, grabbing them by the ankle and apologized to Gwen. Something about Vampire and a moonless night just brought out something in him he really couldn't explain. They arrested everyone and decided it was best to put them all in stasis for temporary holding until the next day. After breakfast, they'd contacted the plumbers to take the prisoners for processing out to the judicial system. They then had to deal with the fact that they no longer had a ship. Though there was a local dealership, they didn't have anything that Ben found impressive. They'd visited with Lucy until a few days later, then hitched a ride to an interstellar dealership that had better ships to pick from. After looking around, they'd found one that would do for now, that had everything they'd needed, with the numbers XGP-15A-2 on it, which whatever, most ships had stuff like that. After paying for the ship and having everything registered, they were deciding on a name for the ship, with Gwen suggesting they call it the Universal Watch. He'd like that and agreed, but suggested the U-Watch for short. The dealership painted the name Universal Watch on the side of the ship for them free of charge, since they'd gotten it with everything they would need moving forwards. Now they just needed to stock up on supplies.